Christopher Okigbo, 1932–1967, one of Nigeria's most profound modernist poets, created a powerful and elusive body of work in a short span of time before his untimely death in the Biafran War. His poetry is marked by complex symbolism, mythological allusions, spiritual yearning, and metaphysical depth. Heavensgate, one of Okigbo's most celebrated poetic sequences, is the opening section of his collected poems, and it serves as a spiritual prelude to his artistic and existential journey. Published in 1962, Heavensgate is often described as Okigbo's spiritual initiation, his encounter with the sacred feminine presence of Idoto, a river deity representing both natural and ancestral forces. The poem reveals a metaphysical awakening, a symbolic return to origins, and a confrontation with destiny. With deep influences from Igbo cosmology, Christianity, and Western literary modernism, Heavensgate is both personal and universal, mapping the soul's passage through doubt, transformation, and enlightenment. Structure and overview. Heavensgate is not a single poem but a sequence of interconnected poetic fragments. These include titled sections such as, Before You, Mother Idoto, Under the Green Tree, The Passage, Love Apart, Initiation, The Passage, Reprise. Together, these segments construct a lyrical journey that fuses nature, memory, dream, and myth. The movement is largely symbolic rather than narrative, reflecting Okigbo's modernist tendency to favor image, suggestion, and mood over linear storytelling. 1. Before You, Mother Idoto. This opening poem is arguably Okigbo's most iconic. It introduces the speaker kneeling before Idoto, a river goddess who, as water goddess, stood in the dream of the forest. The speaker identifies himself as the prodigal, suggesting a return after wandering, a reference both to the biblical parable and to an inner spiritual homecoming. This act of supplication establishes the tone of reverence, humility, and introspection. The invocation of Idoto places the poem within an indigenous African spiritual framework, contrasting with the Western religious paradigms often privileged in colonial discourse. This moment is symbolic of a poet reconnecting with his cultural and spiritual origins. 2. Under the Green Tree. In this section, the setting moves to a lush, verdant space symbolic of fertility and rebirth. The poet references the tribunal of the spirits, indicating a cosmic or ancestral judgment. The poet is not merely passive but is undergoing a ritual of remembrance and confrontation with hidden truths. The green tree also recalls biblical symbols, tree of life, and Igbo cosmology, acting as a bridge between the earthly and divine. This dual symbolism is typical of Okigbo's poetry, where Igbo spirituality and Christian motifs often exist in creative tension. 3. The Passage. This segment marks the transitional moment of the poetic and spiritual journey. The passage is both literal and metaphorical. It may be interpreted as the crossing from ignorance to knowledge, exile to belonging, life to death, or even silence to song. Images of drums, horns, and the starless night fill the lines, creating an atmosphere of ritual and foreboding. There is a sense that the speaker is entering a realm beyond the mundane, where poetic vision and spiritual truth converge. Okigbo's use of music and rhythm here is deeply rooted in oral tradition and echoes the ceremonial language of ancestral rites. 4. Love Apart. This section introduces the theme of separation, not just romantic but metaphysical. The speaker experiences alienation and yearning. The love he refers to could be interpreted as divine love, cultural identity, poetic calling, or a literal lost beloved. The mood becomes more intimate and reflective, showing a poet caught between worlds, suspended between longing and loss. The language becomes more abstract, signaling the fragmentation of identity and the tension between self and calling. 5. Initiation. Here, the spiritual and poetic metamorphosis occurs. The speaker is initiated into deeper mysteries, both personal and cosmic. There is an undertone of shamanic transformation as the poet seems to become a medium, a vessel for revelation. References to water, fire, and stars suggest elemental purification. The poem takes on an almost prophetic voice, announcing the birth of the poet as a spiritual messenger. Okigbo is crafting a myth of the poet as seer, one who must suffer, journey, and return to speak truths to the world. 6. The passage, reprise. The sequence closes by returning to the motif of passage, suggesting a cyclical journey rather than a linear one. The repetition signifies continuity, echoing traditional African cyclical views of time and existence. The poet now seems more aware, more attuned to his role as a mediator between the spiritual and the material, the ancestral and the modern. Themes and analysis. 1. Return to origins. At the heart of Heavensgate lies a spiritual return. Okigbo positions the poet as a prodigal son, estranged from his cultural roots, now kneeling before the feminine divine, asking to be reabsorbed. The reference to Idoto suggests a reawakening to indigenous spirituality, a rejection of colonial alienation, and a profound respect for nature and tradition. This return is not simply nostalgic, it is transformative. The poet must confront pain, ambiguity, and judgment to be reborn. The river, the forest, and the green tree all become symbols of this return, of nature's wisdom and ancestral voice. 2. Syncretism and cultural hybridity. Okigbo weaves together multiple traditions, Igbo cosmology, Christian imagery, and Western literary modernism, notably T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. This blending creates a poetic voice that resists singular identity. He does not reject one tradition in favor of another but instead holds them in dynamic tension. This syncretism reflects the post-colonial reality of African intellectuals who navigate multiple cultural inheritances. The poem thus becomes an arena where these influences wrestle, converse, and ultimately shape a new poetic idiom. 3. The poet as seer and sacrifice. Heavensgate establishes a mythology of the poet. Okigbo presents himself not just as a writer but as a seer, a messenger, a medium. His poetic journey is a rite of passage, a spiritual initiation that sets him apart. But this separation also carries a cost. There is alienation, suffering, and the burden of bearing knowledge. The poet's role is sacrificial, to carry messages from the gods, the dead, and the divine to the living. This self-conception anticipates Okigbo's eventual death in the Biafran War, reinforcing the tragic figure of the poet-prophet who dies for a cause. 4. Silence, language, and revelation. Okigbo is deeply aware of the limitations and powers of language. Much of Heavensgate is preoccupied with silence, music, and the difficulty of articulation. The poem often seems to gesture toward something ineffable, divine presence, ancestral voices, existential truth, that lies beyond words. This tension between speech and silence mirrors the tension between the known and the unknown, the seen and the unseen. Okigbo's poetry becomes an attempt to give voice to what resists articulation, a truly modernist endeavor. 5. Nature and spiritual ecology. The consistent invocation of trees, rivers, stars, and animals shows Okigbo's deep ecological sensibility. But nature here is not passive scenery, it is alive, sacred, and sentient. Idoto is a river goddess, the tree is a tribunal, the forest is a place of judgment and healing. This spiritual ecology challenges anthropocentric views and affirms traditional African understandings of interconnectedness between humans, nature, and the divine. Nature in Heavensgate is a site of communion, not conquest. Style and language. Okigbo's language is dense, lyrical, and highly symbolic. His modernist inheritance is evident in elliptical syntax. He often omits subjects or verbs, creating enigmatic expressions. Mythical allusions. blending African and Western mythologies to create layered meanings. Symbolism. Water, trees, drums, horns, and stars recur as motifs. Musicality. The poem echoes the rhythms of African oral tradition and modernist cadence. His verse is free, flowing, and fragmentary, mirroring the spiritual disorientation and awakening the speaker undergoes. Conclusion. Heavensgate is a profound initiation into Christopher Okigbo's poetic vision, a vision shaped by ancestry, spirituality, and existential inquiry. Through its invocation of Idoto and the spiritual journey of the poet, the sequence maps the return to indigenous roots, the reawakening of cultural memory, and the forging of a new poetic identity that straddles worlds. Okigbo's poetic journey in Heavensgate is not just personal. It speaks to a broader African search for identity in the wake of colonial disruption. It reflects the tension between modernity and tradition, language and silence, exile and homecoming. Ultimately, Heavensgate positions poetry as a sacred calling, a passage not merely into words but into truth, memory, and spiritual vision. It remains a cornerstone of African modernist poetry, challenging, beautiful, and endlessly resonant.